Hello, I'm Richard Miller. Welcome to Chef Richard's Kitchen today. When we think of comfort food, almost everybody thinks of what they grew up with, what they had at home, things like this. Almost everybody gets a good, warm, the fuzzy feelings when you talk about comfort food. And I'm going to do probably several episodes on this where we talk about comfort foods. Today is the first one. And I want to talk about one of the most basic comfort foods of all, meatloaf. Now, some people have good memories of meatloaf. Some people have, how do we put it, somewhat less than fond memories of meatloaf. But when my mother always made it, it was always good. We always enjoyed it. And to me, when somebody starts thinking of back home, that's one of the first things I think of is one of her casseroles or her meatloaf. And so since it was such a big part of my growing up, and a lot of other people's too, as I find out, what I like to do is I like to take this episode and I like to show you a good meatloaf recipe. Now, before we do anything, remember, meatloaf is one of those we've got to mix up and mix and mix and mix. So the first thing you want to do is make sure your hands are clean. Now, I always wash my hands before, handling food, but I wanted to make a big deal out of it this time, just simply because we're going to be doing so much to the meat. Now, remember, we're also going to cook this to about 180 degrees or 185 degrees. The only thing that's going to be killed, but still, remember, when you're fixing meals, what's your primary concern? Your guest, right? So let's not give them anything to worry about. All right, we start out with 3 pounds of ground beef, and I use 80-20. You can use You can use 90-10, 85-15, whatever. I just prefer 80-20. It's a good general purpose, type ground beef, and at the same time, it's reasonably priced. So I usually, almost everything is 80-20. We start out with 3 pounds of that, and to that we take and we're going to add 1.5 cups of oatmeal. Now, a lot of people use breadcrumbs, crackers, really anything, to lighten it up, absorb a little bit of the meat juices, etc., etc. I always liked oatmeal. And, write me a letter, send me a note, tell me what you think, tell me what you like, but I always liked oatmeal. And one of the things that I do, in addition to oatmeal, is I like to take and once I get it out of the little box, I like to put it in a food processor and just grind it down a little bit. Don't grind it to a powder, that's too fine. But just grind it down a little bit. Say, you're grinding them into fourths, something like that. To that, we're going to add 2 cups of milk. And we're going to add 2 eggs. All right. Now we're going to add 2 tablespoons of Worcestershire sauce. A 1.5 teaspoons of salt. Now, usually when it comes to salt, I usually tend to salt on the lower end of the spectrum. And the reason for that is on every table there's a salt and pepper shaker. So if you don't get enough salt in it, You could always take and add a little bit more at the table. But what happens if you get too much in there? Yeah, right. You're kind of SOL. By the way, that means somewhat out of luck, you understand. Teaspoon and a half of salt, probably about a half teaspoon of pepper, and now it's time, we're going to mix everything in. Okay, now that it's mixed in and we've got a nice glop all over our hands, I'm going to go ahead and wash it again before I go ahead and put it in the pans. The reason I wash my hands after this, I know I'm going to get them dirty putting it back in there again, but you get the beef fat on your hands. It's very slippery. It kind of makes a coating on there. It's kind of, I just prefer to wash it again. Now, let's go ahead and before we put them in the pans, I'm going to preheat the oven at 350 degrees. Right, because we're going to cook it at 350 degrees and we're going to let it bake for probably about an hour and a half. Now the last thing that we're going to put in our mixture is we need to chop up a little onion. So I have a little onion here. Now we want to dice this fairly fine, and one of the things I always do is I tend to use a more heavily diced or a larger diced onion, and I find a lot of people prefer the smaller. So remember, when you're thinking of your guests, if they like it smaller, then smaller it is, because they always come first. now we'll work this in. Ah, that's my alarm telling me that the oven's preheated. Okay, now let's put these in here and make sure that there aren't any air pockets down in there. And remember, don't fill it to the top because we're going to be putting a topping, which is some ketchup on here, and we don't want this all the way up to the top. There's one. And there's two. Now let me wash my hands again and we'll put the topping on. Alright, now, essentially the meatloaves are done. Now I want to just put a little ketchup on the top of it. Now, my mother, when I was a kid, my mother always used chili sauce. And she put that on there, which is good, that's fine. I liked it that way. I just prefer it with a little ketchup on there, so here we go. Okay. Now, let's take them over to the oven. Alright, we've preheated our oven to 350 degrees. Let's go ahead and put these in, and we're going to let them bake for about an hour and a half. Alright, let me set the timer. And we'll see you back in probably an hour and a quarter. And the reason I want to come back a little bit early is because you never serve, an entree alone. You always serve it with a little side dish. And I want to serve some broccolini with this. So we'll come back a little early and we'll go ahead and make that. We'll see you in about an hour and a quarter. Okay, it's been time. I went ahead and I checked the meatloaf and I used a thermometer. And it's up to 185 degrees, so we know that it's cooked properly. So let's go ahead and take it out of the oven. Now, meatloaf's like any other kind of a meat. Once you take it out of the oven, it's very hot You need to let it rest a little bit, you need to let it cool down. Otherwise, when you cut it and put it on the plate, all the juices are just going to drain out and it's going to be dry. So let's just go ahead and let's let it rest a little bit. While we're doing that, what I want to do is I want to make a little side dish. And I'm going to do it by making broccolini. And broccolini is very similar to broccoli. In fact, they often call it baby broccoli or Chinese broccoli. And I'm going to clean these up a little bit. I'm going to take the leaves off them. Alright, now that the leaves are off of them, I'm going to cut them off. And we don't really want this back end on this. It's usually very fibrous and very tough. And it's not what we want. Remember, we're wanting the best part of the plant. So let's just go ahead and let's cut a couple inches off of that. Right? Now this part of the plant here is the best part. We're going to go ahead, let's go ahead, and we're going to blanch this. We're not going to steam it a lot, we're not going to fry it or anything else. What we're going to do is blanch it. And what that is kind of a half steaming, half boiling method. And I'm going to put this into a saucepan of boiling water. Sit there for about 5 to 6 minutes until it turns nice and green and it's kind of an al dente, because we don't want it to be too mushy because it isn't going to be very good that way, but at the same time we don't want it to be too crisp because we don't want our guests to think we're making them eat it raw. So let me go ahead and let's wait for a few minutes and we'll pull it out. Broccolini in the saucepan, and by now it's nice and blanched. The meatloaf has rested a little while, so now it's time. Let's go ahead and take them out. Let's plate it. The first thing we want to do is let's bring the meatloaf over and set it over here so we can plate it. Turn the broccolini off. And I'm going to go ahead and drain the water out of it. All right, now let's go ahead and let's put on a little salt, a little kosher salt, a little pepper, and just a little bit of hoisin sauce. And now let's get ready to plate. Now, remember I've always told you that people eat with their eyes long before they actually eat with their taste buds? Well, we have to garnish it. And I'm a big proponent of garnishing. And I think that most people ought to take a good look at this and make sure that they've done everything they can to do it right. Now, here's a couple of things that I have for garnish. Number one, I have onions, green onions. I chop the tip of the onion off, and after about 3 or 4 inches of the green. I have radicchio, which is a red type of a lettuce. It's very bitter, but it does make an excellent garnish. I have fennel fronds, and I have dill. Both of them are very fine, types of garnish and work very well. I have parsley here, which is always good, and almost everybody uses it. And here's something that I haven't used a lot before, and I may start using, and what it is chives. And when chives get to a certain age, what they do is they want to bloom, and that's what this is right here. That's what this is right here. This is the chives bloom. Is it edible? Yes. Is it bitter? Yes. It isn't exactly the way you'd have a chive, but at the same time, it makes an excellent garnish. So, a few things to consider. Let's go ahead and do a little plating now. I'm going to take a couple of strands of the broccolini, and I think what I'll do here is I'm going to put a little radicchio under it, just to give it a nice look. All right, now I cut my meatloaf into fairly thin slices, and what I want to do is I want to give everybody a couple of slices. Like this. All right. Now we have our meatloaf, we have our broccolini. Let's go ahead and let's take a couple of these chives, break them off. Let's put them down by the meatloaf. Let's take a little bit of this hoisin sauce. And let's go ahead and put a little of that down. And really, at this point, I think that's probably plenty. So here we go. We have a very, very comfort meal here. We have meatloaf, broccolini, and it's presented very well. Try it. Let me know what you think. Go ahead and put your comments down. In the meantime, have a good time. God bless. And remember my cardinal rule. Cooking should be fun. Remember that. See you next time.